The way we've set this session up is so that it allows you to use the content of this session either to help you write a business case, or for people that may be in the process of writing them, hopefully it will give you some thoughts about how to review your business case and maybe think about what you want to spend the next few days or weeks sort of focusing on so that you can improve your business case. So I've tried to make it relevant both for people preparing them and also reviewing them. But really our aim is just to help you write the best possible business case that you can. So a couple of slides about SEMLEP just before we get stuck into the main presentation. And for those of you that don't know me, I'm Judith Barker, the Director of Programmes and Governance here at SEMLEP. And so my role is very much to deliver the funding programmes that SEMLEP has had since 2015. And therefore, I hope that I've got a lot of relevant experience to share in terms of looking at business cases and particularly looking at good business cases. And you can see here from this slide, SEMLEP does a lot in terms of producing the strategic framework to support sustainable economic growth, working with partners to do that, as well as delivering the growth. And so this webinar fits in very much with that in terms of we're trying to work with you as all of our partners to maximise the amount of money that we can get into the SEMLEP area. So that's very much what we're trying to do today, is to support you to ensure that we have the benefits of government money in this area. And of course, you'll all know and recognise that the SEMLEP area, Northamptonshire, going down to Luton, including Central Beds, Bedford, Milton Keynes and the two new unitary authorities. So what we're going to cover today is an overview of the 5-case business model, which was what comprises a business case. I'm going to look at each of those 5 cases. I'm going to indicate 4 areas that I think are particularly important to sort of double check you've covered. And then because we have government deadlines for the Levelling Up Fund and Community Renewal Fund of the 18th of June, I'm particularly going to recap on some of the guidance there. And as I say, I will try and leave some time for questions, but I am mindful of trying to get through the content as well. And as I said at the beginning, I've tried to make this webinar suitable for anyone that's either preparing or reviewing a business case with the view to improving it. And hopefully you'll find it really useful to the work that you're doing. So before I go any further, can I just ask one of my colleagues to let me know if there's any questions in the chat at the moment that I need to address before we sort of start into the main business?
Not currently, no.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Emma. Really appreciate that. Okay, so an overview of the 5-case business model. So one of the things that a business case does is it allows you to spend that upfront time making sure that you've properly scoped, planned and costed your project from the outset. It's certainly my experience that this time, although it's a huge amount of investment and it can be a stressful time as you head towards those deadlines, the value that you put in now will be more than rewarded later. And I certainly have seen in our experience of running the LGF projects, we've had over 60 capital projects that have gone through our approval process. And of those, only 5 have not actually been delivered. And I do think that reflects the amount of effort that went in up front in order to get those right. Now, we all know things can go wrong in any project, but I do think the work that you put in at the beginning really allows you to manage the project to delivery later on. And so there's some key things there which we're going to go through in detail and are perhaps best summarised by the next slide, which sets out these 5 bubbles, which covers the 5 cases. So this is important. And if you look at the application forms for Levelling Up and Community Renewal Fund, although they're not set out in these headings, the forms absolutely ask the questions that are within each of these 5 cases. So the first question, is the project applicable? Does it fit with the national, the local, the regional strategic direction of travel? What's the scope of the project? What's the problem? What's the project trying to solve? What are the objectives of the project? So all of those things go into the strategic case. The economic case is really asking, does this project deliver economic value? Does it stack up? So is it appropriate? Is it a good use of public money? The third, fourth and fifth cases are what are sometimes grouped together to be called the delivery cases, but they all look at a slightly different aspect of delivery. So the commercial case looks at whether you can deliver it and whether it will be attractive to somebody to deliver. So in other words, if you go out to procure, are you going to be successful in that? The financial case looks at affordability. Do you know the costings and can you afford to do this project? Is the funding there to deliver it? And then the fifth case, the management case, is can it be successfully delivered? Is it achievable? And can you show that you've got the resources to deliver it? And given the timings on the Levelling Up Fund and Community Renewal Fund, I think that's going to be a really critical thing across the business case. So that's the five cases. And what I'm now going to do is to go into each of those in a little bit of detail. And I'm going to try and bring out some of our experience of local growth fund projects and other revenue projects that we've been involved with to try and bring some of these questions and issues alive for you. So hopefully you get a better sense of the sorts of things that need to go into the case, and that will perhaps help you shape your own applications. So the strategic case. So that's the first one. And I think the key thing with the strategic case, and this does come through again, the applications for community renewal and levelling up, is really what's described in those applications forms as the theory of change. So you may have picked up, if those are the forms you're looking at, about this question of what is the theory of change. Now, for me, the theory of change is really about identifying what the problem is and what you're proposing to do about it. So in other words, what is the change that you're trying to bring about and why? And that's what the strategic case, the justifying action. What's the problem? What are you proposing to do about it? What change are you trying to bring about? So an example of that might be a town centre business and enterprise hub for the creative and digital sector. So what is the problem that you are trying to solve by that project? Now, it might be that there's several different problems that you're trying to solve. It might be the physical infrastructure of that part of the town centre. It might be the needs of the creative and digital sector. It might be a general lack of business space altogether, or it might be in part a kind of public realm, or even, you know, a sustainable travel kind of aspect. So there might be a number of different projects, but it's well worth making sure that you're clear what the problems are and then what you're trying to do about it. And that should then lead directly to you being able to answer the questions about why is the project needed, because that's basically what is the problem. And then it will lead directly into what are the objectives for the project, and indeed, how does it fit with the relevant strategies and policies? So clearly, if you are bringing forward a particular town centre business and enterprise hub, then you would hope that you would be able to, for instance, look at the national government industrial strategy and other documents that would be relevant. It might be, you know, initiative, government policy in terms of town centre and place that you could refer to, focus on sustainable travel from DFT, but you should be able to draw on national and local policies and strategies, which should all be available online, in order to demonstrate that what you're putting forward as a solution to this problem is sensible and fits with the policy framework. Because clearly, if it goes against the policy framework, that isn't likely to be successful in a business case. So setting out how what you're proposing fits with the wider policy framework is important. One of the things you need to think about is, why is public funding needed? And that may well knit back to, why is the project needed? Because clearly, if the market was going to solve the problem, then the problem wouldn't require this business case to be written and funding to be drawn in. So one of the things you're going to need to set out in terms of your problem is why it hasn't been solved already, and therefore why public intervention is required. But hopefully that gives you a strong sense of what you need to put into your strategic case. So summarised by what is the project, what will it deliver, why is it needed? And I think particularly important is that theory of change. What is the problem and what are you going to do about it? And this is an example of a project that has some of the aspects of the example that I was just giving in Luton, very near the station. Many of you will see that poster on the wall from the Luton railway station, and it's a redevelopment of 4 factory buildings in Luton, and part of their opening event, which was in September 2019, which feels after lockdown a long time ago now, but certainly their business case really did set out those different aspects of how they were going to use that facility to solve the problems that I've just described. One of the things that's really important in the strategic case and is referred to in the application form processes for Levelling Up and Community Renewal is the shortlisting of options. What are the different options you've thought about? And I feel this is a really important aspect of what you're doing in a business case. And it is actually really compelling. So it is worth spending a bit of time on this. And really what you're doing is you're going back to the problem that you've identified, and you're basically asking yourself, what is the way we could, what are the different ways we could solve that problem? And so you're likely to say, okay, but there might be 10 ways, and then you can review those 10 ways and come to the conclusion of what is the best way, assessing the different projects on that list. Now, clearly, when you're working at speed, you might have just a short list, but it's a really compelling thing to do because it really enhances your justification of why this is a project worth funding, because you're setting out what the problem is, what the various ways were of doing it, and then why you've picked this one. And actually that narrative is very powerful to somebody reading a business case. And what you do need to consider is what would happen if you did nothing, and what would happen if you did the minimum. And that really demonstrates what you get if you add the project on top of the doing nothing. You really get a sense of the extent to which this proposal that you're developing really adds value and really brings the outputs to get, really delivers on the problem that you've set out. So that is really worth spending a little bit of time on, and both of the application forms do include that options analysis, and it is persuasive when it's done well. Now, before we go into the economic case, can I just check, Emma, if there's any questions at all?
No, the only request is for slides after their presentation, which we've agreed to share as part of the presentation and video. So that's all the requests so far.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, so we've covered one of the 5, and the next case is the economic case, which is really why we justify the why public funding should be used on this project. So we're asking ourselves, what are the economic impacts of the project? But it's also the time when we can show the social and environmental impacts of the project as well. So it really is that time when you set out what are the impacts, outputs, outcomes that you're aiming to achieve. And critically, what you're doing is you're saying this project is going to cost us, let's say, £500,000, and you're going to put a value on what the benefits are that you're going to deliver. So that might be jobs, that might be learners, that might be it might be business space, it might be all sorts of things that could flow from either a capital or a revenue project, but you're going to put a value on them, and then you're going to compare that with the cost. and you're going to come up with some kind of ratio that says, right, our costs are this, our benefits are that. And although in the government guidance in November 2020 on the Green Book appraisal of business cases, they have made clear that the strategic case is just as important as the ratio of the costs and the benefits. It is still really compelling to be able to demonstrate that the level of benefits and the value of those benefits that you're delivering. So it's certainly something that's really worth looking at and maximising, because one of the things we've always got to remember is a business case will always be being compared against another business case, and the best costs benefit analysis that you can provide, which demonstrates how good value for money your project delivers by having the smallest amount of cost for the greatest amount of benefit, is always going to be really compelling and stand your project in a good chance of succeeding. So it is something, again, that's worth considering. One of the things you do also need to consider is the extent to which your the benefits that you're setting out are genuinely additional and attributable. So can you really say that the outputs that you're suggesting will happen from this project? So you need to test yourself a bit on that. And are they additional? So would they happen anyway? Or are they genuinely something that is only happening because of your project? You do also need to consider, is it actually displacing something that would have happened there anyway? Or is it causing something to move 10 yards down the road or 100 yards down the road? So you do need to challenge yourself a little bit on that, but it is really compelling when it's done well. And, you know, it's a key part of the economic case. One of the things you should also do in this economic case is relate that back to your options appraisal, because it might be when you did that options appraisal that you had 2 or 3 ways of actually delivering successfully the objectives of your project. But it might be that one of them was either the cheapest or delivered the greatest number of outputs. And so, of course, that will increase the value for money of that particular project, of that particular shortlisted project. So it's always worth considering the value for money as part of that shortlisting that we discussed earlier, because that might allow you to pick the most compelling project from your exercise of sort of testing out which project actually delivered the outcomes. Now, just to give you a flavour of that, I've got a couple of examples here of where you can kind of demonstrate how you can make a case. So on the slides here, some people on the call may well recognise the iWorks buildings in Bedford. Now, Bedford Borough Council worked with SEMLEP some years ago now to make the case for these units. And it probably is the case that the market might have delivered something on this site, but the market would not have delivered small manufacturing units for the types of business that the council and other providers were keen to see. They would have, for instance, it might have been a large shed that was developed that the market might have wanted, but it wouldn't have supported small businesses in the way that the council wanted to do. And so what we were able to do is set out what the problem was, set out what the solutions were, and bring forward the scheme based on the look at the outputs, look at the investment, and show how these kind of units with a certain level of investment were able to bring forward a different sort of economic growth, a different sort of job numbers, a different sort of value of jobs than would have otherwise happened. In other cases, it's the situation that actually the site wouldn't be brought forward at all without public investment. It might be that the conditions on the site, the abnormal costs or something, are just too great, or the location is not one that the private sector would automatically invest in. But it's important to tell that story of why the investment is justified. What this slide does is bring out the golden thread of how all of this kind of fits together. So in the strategic case, we talked about having the problem and setting out the objectives. And now we've been talking about the outputs and the impacts. And obviously what you're kind of doing is setting out this logic chain, or this golden thread of how your objectives should flow into the activities, which is obviously the project itself, which delivers the immediate outputs, which might be the jobs, which delivers the immediate inputs, which delivers the impacts, which might be, for instance, people having more income and therefore spending in the town centre, for example, which then might start to contribute to some of those conditions or the problem that we discussed in the first place. And then at that point would obviously be where you start to evaluate the impact of the project. But that's a useful technique to making sure that you think, okay, if we do all of these things, is it going to influence the conditions? Is it going to go back to the objectives? And really testing, is my theory of change working? Or actually, do we need to change the project a little bit to refine the activities, refine the outputs, the impacts and the conditions, so we have more impact on the problem that we initially defined. So taking your project around that little loop is really, really useful, and that hopefully is a useful tool for you to think about. So this slide is just a quick recap on the economic case. The importance of value for money, the importance of robustness, and I've got the link in there to the 2020 guidance on a Green Book appraisal. So if you do feel the need to dive into the detail, that is there. And I also wanted to pick out, because I know particularly for Community Renewal Fund projects, there's some of the impacts that you're going to have are actually going to be quite difficult to put pounds and pence values to. But there are things that you can find online that kind of provide proxies for some of that. So for instance, the value of health, etc. So there are some ways of doing that. And I think it is really, really important to capture those social and environmental benefits as well, and well worth spending a little bit of time ensuring that they're in your cost benefit analysis, because they may well be a key part of what you're trying to deliver. So before I go into the deliverability cases, can I just see if there's any questions at all?
There is one hand up by Lucy Hawes.
Okay.
Hey there.
Lucy.
Hiya.
Hi, Lucy. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, please. Where you were talking about impacts, is that what you would also call the outcomes?
Exactly right. Yes, I'm using impacts and outcomes interchangeably in this presentation. Yes.
Thanks very much.
No, that's a pleasure. And Prince.
Yeah, the non-monetized impact, you said there is a way that can be done into the cost-benefit analysis. Do you have any suggestions as to how that can be done? I know you mentioned it, but it wasn't that clear to me.
Okay, yes, of course. Yeah, that's, yes, what I would suggest you do if you want to look into that, and it probably would be the subject of an entirely another webinar altogether, but you could certainly, if you look into social return on investment and look into the detail of that, that is a technique about effectively giving financial value to things that otherwise you wouldn't necessarily cost. So for instance, you know, there's university studies and other things you can find online where people have put a financial value to empowerment, confidence, health benefits, and all of those kind of things. And so if you Google social return on investment and then look into maybe some sample reports that you can find of where people have put a financial value on a particular thing, then you could use that as an example. I mean, if you want to, there's plenty of courses available on social return on investment. So if you wanted to go further, you could do that. But that's where I would start, looking at examples of social return on investment. And actually the Scottish government have done a lot of work on that agenda, and there's a lot of things related to major investments in Scotland that you can look at those examples on.
All right, thank you.
All right, hopefully that's helpful. Is there any other questions, Emma?
No, there's no questions in the chat and no hands currently raised.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emma. I really appreciate it. It's hard to keep track of everything when you're doing this. Okay, so the three deliverability cases. So I'll go through these if that's okay. So the commercial case, and I am very aware that actually the commercial case, which is really about procurement primarily, will be very, very different in a revenue project as against a capital project. So I think we need to be very clear on that. However, particularly on levelling up and community renewal, because the government timetables are so quick for both submission and delivery, I think it does need considerable thought in terms of how what you're doing in terms of procurement. So different things to consider. How are you going to procure? Is there a procurement element? If there isn't a procurement element, how else are you going to go about delivering? And is the relationship with any of the private sector partners clear? So you need to work through how and with whom the procurement exercise is going to happen, and be clear if it is a capital project, who's going to own the assets at the end of it, because clearly there are lots of different ways of procuring things, lots of different ways of funding things, and all of that just needs to be considered. I think at the moment, one of the key things in terms of procurement for current funding opportunities is that question about the timetable. What time have you set aside to do a procurement? And what is the market situation? And certainly in our experience on Local Growth Fund at the moment, there's a lot of variation on lead times for capital items. Some things it's very easy to get hold of. Other things, whether it be plaster, windows or doors, can be particularly challenging to get hold of at the moment. So actually, what goods are you procuring? And also what services are you procuring? So with a lot of building work going on at the moment, it can be very difficult to get hold of building contractors. There might be a lot of cost inflation because of the amount of demand there is. And particular packages of work can be very challenging. So earthworks in particular can be causing some challenges at the moment. So thinking through the commercial procurement situation and what the risks are and how you're going to manage those things are very live issues at the moment. Another thing that I was going to mention when I spoke about this slide, and is in the application process for Levelling Up and Community Renewal Fund, is subsidy control. So subsidy control replaced what was called state aid. So when we left the EU on the 31st of December last year, up until that point, we had a state aid system. And what that was an EU-wide system. And what that did was it basically said, that the public sector was allowed to support the private sector or private type activities private type activities if it wasn't going to distort the market, and only up to certain limits. So there was permitted levels of subsidy for particular activities where the public sector could provide money to the private sector to do certain activities. There's a new system called subsidy control that is very similar to state aid, but is basically the UK government's way of managing what was called state aid. Now, I'm not going to cover any more details on this at the moment, but the forms do ask about subsidy control. From Monday, we're going to have our SEMLEP policy on subsidy control up on our website on the Local Growth Fund documentation page. And if anybody wants to look at it, then you'll be very welcome to take some of the details from it. But it certainly is worth making sure that you have considered the issues of subsidy control, because it isn't just possible for the public sector to give the private sector significant funds. It is important that you have gone through a full and competitive procurement process to be able to demonstrate that you have provided best value and that you aren't actually subsidising a contractor. So it's really, really important just to think that through, the legal basis of what you're doing. Clearly, it's going to be more significant in bigger schemes, but it's a risk worth exploring. And I think if in doubt, you know, I would have to advise that people take legal advice on that area. But hopefully our policy document, as I say, will be on our website from Monday, will help people on that. So quick recap on the commercial case. Need to make sure that you have got people out there who could meet your needs, and that it is reasonable to assume that a contract could be agreed given the constraints that you're working in. And I think one of those in particular at the moment would be time. This is an example of, I think it's the modernising modern methods of construction at Bedford College. This is an example of one of our Getting Building Fund projects, which again, Bedford College had to move to procure very quickly. And actually it's quite interesting that they over time have looked at lots of different ways of procuring. Obviously you can go through an exercise where you might procure a lead contractor and then they would then procure subcontractors, but equally Bedford College have on other projects acted as the lead contractor themselves and individually contracted all the subcontractors themselves as a different management technique of procurement. So that how you do procurement is certainly something that needs consideration in terms of how you're going to manage it, how you're going to manage the risks, who's going to cover the risks, and it's something that different people have handled in different ways over time. So the financial case. So as you would of course know, the financial case is really asking two fundamental questions, despite the fact that there being 7 on the screen right now. But the two fundamental questions are, what are the costs and can you afford them? That's basically the two things you're looking at. So are all the costs identified, and have you secured the match? So clearly if you're asking for a grant, you know, let's say you've got £1 million project, you might only have the match of 750,000, and that's why you're asking for £250 grant. But what we're looking to do in any appraisal is to make sure that the rest of the match is secured. And when I say secured, obviously secured as far as is possible given the stage you are at in the project. But yes, that's important. So to have as much security around that match funding as you can. And again, given timing, that is going to have to be well advanced. Now, obviously, if you haven't gone out to procurement, you won't have your absolute final costs, but have you got a way of demonstrating that these costs are reasonable, maybe against a previous project or benchmarks? That's a good way of sort of being able to demonstrate that you're offering value for money. And you do also need to be able to demonstrate that actually as an applicant who is going to receive funding, is your organisation able to demonstrate that it has the cash flow or the strength as robustness as an organisation to actually make this project work? So that is important in terms of, you know, have you got the right lead partner for this project that is sufficiently robust to be able to manage the cash flow in terms of how the grant is spent? Because if you got, say, 50% upfront and only 50% at the end, can you actually manage the cash flow challenges of that? So it's you need to kind of explore that. I think one of the other things to consider is, you know, the what ifs. So that question, does the proposal take account of potential time and cost overruns? That's a real issue for both capital and revenue projects. In the community grants programme that we run, obviously a lot of those grants were approved and then providers realised they had to move online. And then that obviously potentially, well, there's savings sometimes in travel and room hire, but then there's also considerable cost in IT potentially. So you've got to think about the what ifs, what risks have we got, and have we built in some contingency, and how could we deal with some of those risks? And then finally, do make sure, if it's a requirement of the fund, which is on Levelling Up and Community Renewal, that you've made provision for monitoring and evaluation. So you need to build in the financial cost of doing that activity as well. So hopefully that gives you a quick guide of the different aspects of that financial case to consider. So just to draw it out again, the critical thing is that the costs are realistic, and that it is fully funded. And certainly in our experience, that funding package is the most challenging aspect of getting the funding approved. And particularly, it can take time, and clearly with people being in, with the uncertainty at the moment, it can be particularly challenging to pull that together, but I'm sure you're all more than aware of that. So the third of the delivery cases is the management case. So this is really where you set out that you can do what you say you're going to do, that there is a clear delivery plan. It fits within the timescales of the funding, and that you have the experience of doing this kind of work. So that's really key. I think one of the things that I always focus on in this management case is the risk management. What experience have the people running the project got, and what have they said about their risk management arrangements? So the risk register itself is a really powerful tool for understanding the analysis that's gone on behind the project. And that is important because that feeds back into the financial case. Because if the risk management's strong and it's clear that people have thought about the risks and how they would mitigate them, and that feeds back into the financial case, then it gives a lot of confidence in the project. So it is very important. And as I say, the monitoring and evaluation is one of the key parts of the Community Renewal and Levelling Up Fund. So making sure that you've got those proportionate and acceptable ways of managing the monitoring and evaluation is important, because that is going to carry some weight in the assessment. So to sum up the management case, we've got there the importance of being able to demonstrate that you can deliver and that it feels robust. So those are really key aspects to the management case. And this picture from the summer of 2019, it feels like an awful long ago, when my hair was a lot shorter than it is now, when we were at the East Northants Enterprise Centre. And one of the things, that project was a 2018 bidding round project for LGF. And I think I'm right in saying, I'm sure one of my colleagues will correct me if I'm wrong, that it was the first of the 2018 bidding round projects to start on site. And the reason it was so quick to get on site was because they had a really detailed project plan right from the outset. Their risk management was really compelling in their application and was taken right into the project. And that was both in terms of the construction, but also the wider project risks. And those processes that were robust at the beginning and robust before the project started remained robust throughout. There was excellent teamwork on the project, both from the contractors, some of whom you can see, the team at the council, and the team that were going to be focused on delivering the project as well were hugely engaged. The people who would be in the building once the building was built. And I think that is a really good example of how that upfront investment was then taken into that delivery and led to successful delivery. And that really leads me onto something I wanted just to sort of draw out for everybody before we go into the details about the Levelling Up Fund and the Community Renewal Fund. And that's 4 things that I think are really important as you finalise a good business case. Now, I'm sure somebody else would pick out 4 different things, but I feel that these are 4 things to focus on as you double check your business case and make sure that you're satisfied with what you've done. So the first one I would draw out is the clarity of your objectives. Frankly, you would be amazed how many business cases I've read where the detail that's clearly gone into the whole thing is absolutely fantastic, But unfortunately, the clarity about what the project was itself at the beginning was possibly the weakest part of the whole bid. So I think making sure that what your problem is, and as I said at the beginning in the strategic case, what is the theory of change? What is the problem you're trying to solve? And what are your objectives in solving it? So that is really important. Really, if you've got a really brief, succinct explanation of what your project is and what its objectives are, and those objectives are smart, then that makes it a really easy application to read, and a really powerful document. And it's brilliantly helpful for you in terms of then setting it, you're setting out what your vision is for the future, and it's far easier for you in terms of engaging your team members in delivering that vision. So that kind of view of the future that's set out in your objectives, I think, is incredibly useful for the person appraising the paperwork, but is also a really powerful tool for you in project delivery as well. So the second thing I would tease out is that options appraisal that I talked about, because clearly if you can set out why you picked what you picked as the preferred option, that is a powerful message and a powerful narrative for somebody reading it. And this slide with this graph, I think, is quite useful just to look at for 1 minute, because you can see you've got time and benefits on the axis, and the reference case, basically what that reference case is what would happen anyway, because normally you won't have a situation when absolutely nothing would happen unless you did the project. It does obviously is sometimes the case, but normally something will happen. And then what you're saying with the project is the kind of orange line that goes off the top there. And you're saying this is the value we're adding. And you might be able to say that what we're doing without our project, things would happen more slowly, or they would happen to a much lesser extent. And you might be able to say that nothing would happen at all. But just thinking that through of which option gives you the biggest impact, what gives you the biggest gap between the black line and the orange line, and what are your, is it happening faster? Is it happening on a bigger scale? Are the outputs, how significant are the outputs and outcomes that you're going to deliver? That is a really compelling story. And if you can do that with a graphic, then that could be really powerful as well. But yeah, it's worth a reflection on that. So that would be my second thing. Do the options appraisal and see what your biggest impact is. A project plan. I think for the funds that we're currently looking at, and indeed any other, the project plan is really critical. And making sure that your project plan does everything on this slide is really, really important, because when delivery has got to be so quick, the person reading and appraising the project has got to be very, very sure that the person who's writing the bid is very clear how it's going to be delivered and that it can be delivered. So it's really, really important to have as detailed a project plan as is realistic for what you're doing. And I think that's equally true of a revenue project as it is of a capital project, because when you're working at pace, a really detailed project plan is really powerful. Alongside my fourth key area, which is that risk management, which we talked about before, making sure that you have considered if recruitment is a key part of your revenue project, what if the recruitment fails? What are you going to do? What are your backup plans for that? What if your procurement fails? How are you going to manage that? What's your backup plan for that? What if, God forbid, there's another lockdown in next autumn? How are you going to deal with that? I think all the kind of the what if questions when you're working at pace is really important to consider. So before we go on to this next slide about looking at community renewal and levelling up, I'm just going to pause to see if there's any questions on any of the 5 business cases that I've talked about so far, or any general questions that anybody would like to ask. I can see one hand, Prince.
My question is based on a general one that you did mention earlier on about when the project is done and then you have those fixed assets, what are you going to do with that?
Yeah.
Now, if the project is an ongoing project, but at the same time, you still need to give a deadline of that project anyway because of the funding, how do you navigate that aspect?
So you're saying if you create something of value which will then have a continuing role within the project, but in a different project?
Yeah. So yeah, that's right. So, and sometimes the project might not be just for a year, but then the funding requirement is that the project must end within a year. But your project is a long term, not just a specific year.
Yes. So if there's certain assets that are being created, then as long as you're clear on the ownership of those assets and that ownership is remaining with the organisation that was funded, then that should be okay. So for instance, if we support with a grant an organisation to build a building, then the funding might finish next year, but the asset should last for 20 years. And we ask that for at least the first 5 years, it remains in the ownership of the organisation that we provided the funding to, or we have to agree as the funder that basically the funding agreement and the responsibilities in the funding agreement are transferred with the building to another owner with our consent. So it's really about the assets remaining in the ownership of the organisation that received the grant funding. But that's absolutely fine for that to happen. I mean, clearly there might be some funds where there's a slightly different position on that, but that would be the general position that is more typical.
Okay, thanks.
Brilliant. Okay, Nicola.
Thanks, Judith. Really, really helpful presentation. Can you just remind us, going back to the weighting that the assessors will put on the 5 elements there that you've gone through, the different cases? I think you mentioned at the beginning around kind of economic case in the Green Book and how the cost benefit has changed a little bit. But is there anything that you think the government is going to change in terms of how they view the 5 cases, or will they look at them fairly evenly?
That's a really good question, and I have been looking at the guidance on the government website and the application forms and the technical advice for lead authorities and so on, certainly on community renewal. I'm probably slightly less cited on the Levelling Up Fund at the moment. I'm not seeing a weighting like that at the moment. So what SEMLEP typically do is we give basically equal weight. So we basically divide it into thirds. We give equal weighting to the strategic case, the economic case, and then the 3 deliverability cases we take as one. So we kind of in effect create a third, and a third. Now, I don't know how the government will choose to do it, but I would certainly think that they will have to have a very high, they will at the very least have to give an equal weighting to deliverability as to strategic and economic because of the nature of the timing of the funds. I can't see how they could give the emphasis to the strategic and economic case overwhelmingly, because they simply won't, the deliverability will be of too lower importance in the overall scoring. I mean, they have got, one of the ways they're managing that, I guess, is by having these gateway criteria at the beginning of the form. So they've got, I can't remember, 8 or 9 things whereby you have to pass that, and if you pass that, then they'll go on to appraise it. And some of those in effect are kind of more deliverability type issues. So I think that to some extent they're managing it initially by having a gateway and if you miss any of the gateway criteria, they won't appraise it. And then they go into the sort of detail. But yeah, they certainly in the 2020, November 2020 guidance, the key thing that they were looking at doing there, and that was because of the government's levelling up agenda, they were concerned that people, that authorities, LEPs in other parts of the country were basically supporting projects because it had a good cost benefit cost ratio, and not because strategically it was the right thing to do for the problem. So in other words, because it appeared to offer value for money, they were doing it rather than the extent to which it actually solved the problem that was stated. And so what the guidance does is put a greater emphasis on an equal weighting on the strategic case and the economic case. So it kind of slightly rebalanced things. So people are less driven by the benefit cost ratio, more driven by the strategic case. But the extent to which that balance has changed and how it will play out, I don't know any more than that, I'm afraid. Okay, is there anybody else with a hand up or any more questions being asked that I can help with at this point?
No hands up at the moment. Our Prince Caesar's just opened it. However, in the chat, Tony Nags has shared a link for the Community Renewal Fund with the criteria and the 5 areas of assessment.
Brilliant, and that is what I'm going to be doing now. So that's perfectly linked. Thank you, Emma. Okay, so the UK Community Renewal. So it sounds like Tony saved me a job there. So all I've got is one slide on each of these. To give a bit of a run through, and I'm sure many of you are as well cited on these details as I am, but I wanted to make sure that I shared the information that I could, and we had a sort of time after the first hour to focus on these 2 funds. So we've got the UK Community Renewal Fund first, and the link, it sounds like is already in the chat I've put on this slide. And this fund is in effect a pilot year 0 ahead of the launch of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, or UK SPF, which we're expecting to be launched in 2022. So UK Shared Prosperity Fund was a fund that was being seen as replacing the European money that obviously we previously had, ERDF, ESF, and a sort of future local growth fund. But obviously we haven't received, it's not in the public domain yet, the details about the longer term aspirations of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. But what we have got is the UK Community Renewal Fund as a pilot year to explore some techniques ahead of the formal launch. And there's £220 million of investment available this financial year. And the government has published in those details with that link 100 priority places, which in the SEMLEP area, Northamptonshire, there's the Northamptonshire is where those areas are, or in other words, there's I think 3 places within Northamptonshire that qualify for those priority places under the old district council areas, which obviously have now been superseded by the unitary from the 1st of April. But I should be absolutely clear, all areas can bid. It's just those priority places can access capacity funding and will have a higher priority in terms of bidding. But they are also clear that if they don't meet the criteria, then they won't receive the funding. So it is likely that there's going to be a mix of the priority areas and the non-priority areas. But all areas can bid, but some areas have been given that priority status. The funding that's available is 90% revenue. And the priorities are set out there. So it's investment in skills, so work-based training, including digital skills, investment in local businesses, creating jobs, supporting innovation and decarbonisation. And there's a real net zero theme throughout both of these funds. Investment in communities in place, so it's around energy, digital regeneration projects, But obviously we've got to remember it's still a 90% revenue fund. So it's about how you make those things happen using revenue funding. And it's about supporting people into employment. So people who are currently outside of employment and how you can support them. So maybe with the sorts of activities that we perhaps saw in the past through European Social Fund projects as well. So they're the priorities. And they are, the way that the fund is being managed is that local authorities are being asked to lead an application process. So they can go through a process of requesting applications. And I know, for instance, in Northamptonshire and West Northants, they have a process that's open at the moment that closes on the 3rd of May. They will then go through a process of appraising those bids, and then they will make a choice about what they shortlist and what they submit to government, comprising a bid of up to £3 million, which needs to be submitted by the 18th of June. And clearly each local authority will have its own way of doing that, and there is technical guidance about how local authorities act as lead applicants on that. And as I say, there's a theme of those net carbon objectives, and there's a section on the application form to set out the regard of the equality duty, although my understanding is that isn't a formal part of the appraisal, but people are being asked to set out how they're handling that. And my understanding is from all of the prospectus and the application information is that the government will then commence appraising those bids and complete that in the summer with a view to early autumn announcements. Now, but I know in talking to the government, they don't know how many bids they're going to get. And clearly if every local authority bids, they are going to have and it's a national thing. So it's Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and all of England. So there is likely to be a very large volume. So they will have a very tough workload if every area bids. It's going to be interesting to see when in the autumn they are able to complete those appraisals and make those announcements. But that is the process on that. And then I will go through the Levelling Up Fund as well. So I've embedded the link to the Levelling Up Fund information here as well. This is a different scale of opportunity, and this is the first round of a fund which has over £4 billion over 4 years to 24-25. So this isn't being seen as a forerunner to UK SPF. This is a more distinctive, longer term product of itself. They have 800 million of investment to start on site in 2021-22. And as I understand it, each local authority can bid on a per constituency, per MP constituency basis for up to 20 million, with in some cases that are permitted to have a larger bid. Again, they have that kind of priority places approach, and in our area, Luton and Northamptonshire are in priority 1, but there's also priority 2 and priority 3. It's a slightly different way it's been done for this fund, but I'm sure you'll know which area you're in, and if you don't, it's all on the website. And this fund is 100% capital, so there's no revenue element. And the priorities are set around transport investment, regeneration and town centre investment, and cultural amenities investment, and all the details about what that means and what that includes are set out in the prospectus. Again, it's local authorities that are leading that application process, and bids are due up to, as I say, of that order, again, by the 18th of June. It can be one big project, or it can be a package of individual projects which add up to a coherent whole. What it can't be is 2 or 3 things that don't add up to a coherent whole. It has to be a programme of activity that's got a clear strategic focus. And once again, those net zero objectives are embedded into the principles of the Levelling Up Fund, and the same approach is taken on the public sector equality duty. As I said before, my understanding is it's not being formally scored, but it does need to be in there. And as I understand it, the timing of the process is similar in that the bidding round closes at the same time. The government will be appraising the bids. I know, for instance, talking to DfT yesterday, they have got teams of people ready to start after the 18th of June on transport related appraisals. And we're expecting autumn announcements. And in terms of the spend, my understanding on the Levelling Up Fund is these projects need to be able to start on site by March 2022, and that is a gateway criteria matter. So if you can't start on site by March 22, you're not likely to get through the process. And in terms of the Community Renewal Fund position, my understanding is that all of the revenue needs to be defrayed in 21-22. So in other words, if you receive the money in the autumn, the challenge will be to spend all the money by March 22. So it is a heck of an ask. The deadline to get the submissions in by the 18th of June is one thing, and then to deliver it is quite another. And on Levelling Up, they expect the match to be provided at least 10%. Now, again, I imagine clearly that's going to be part of any value for money exercise, but that appears to be a minimum that's been set. But clearly, the more match it is, the better value for money the project is likely to offer. So it's worth bearing that in mind. So that is a very quick trot through the Levelling Up Fund and Community Renewal Fund. And perhaps at that point, I can pause and take any questions.
There are a couple of questions in the chat, Judith. So James Bambridge has asked if there's any opportunities for consortiums, particularly around grassroots organisations with regard to the £250,000 threshold for smaller organisations that obviously can't meet that criteria necessarily but perform and recruit to the target markets.
Yes, I think it is, that is definitely a challenging issue is the size, because on community renewal, my understanding is that the prospectus indicates that your project needs to be at least 500,000, which, as you suggest, for small organisations is very challenging. My understanding is that there is nothing to stop a consortium bid. So a group of community or other organisations could group together, submit a bid to a local authority for the Community Renewal Fund, and then that would be appraised. I don't see any reason why that, I don't see any bar to that, but obviously you would need to have one lead organisation that was sufficiently large to be able to manage the risks of that and could manage the cash flow, and that might be, that might be challenging. But there's nothing to bar you. But I absolutely recognise the dilemma and the problem because of the scale and the scale of the project and the deliverability challenge in that threshold it feels like a bar to small organisations, even if that isn't actually what's set out in the criteria of the fund. And I would suggest that, depending on where you are, you reach out to the local authority that's leading and actually have a conversation with them now about how you might manage some of those. So, I don't know where you're at, but I would strongly recommend having those conversations.
Tony Nags has agreed that consortiums are the probably best way forward, but James has asked specifically, with the timing being quite short, how a consortium would be able to be formed so quickly.
Yes, I agree. It would be, I agree. It would be almost impossible if it's not already there. And I know in I have had conversations with the government about these funds, and I think one of the difficulties with this is that unless, in terms of levelling up, unless you are incredibly well advanced, unless a local authority is well advanced with a large capital project, it's highly unlikely that you could get on site in March 2022, because when you think of the planning and the procurement for a large capital project, I mean, I've been working on some large capital projects like that for 4 or 5 years now that are coming to fruition. So that is incredibly challenging, and I absolutely agree with you that from small organisations participating in this funding, if those consortiums aren't there now, and for instance in North and West Northants, the closing date for their application process is the 3rd of May, it's not likely to be possible to pull this together in that time frame. I mean, one of the things that I know I have had conversations with people about in recent weeks is thinking that it's likely, clearly only likely, I can't say any more than that, but it is likely that there will be opportunities for Community Renewal Fund next year. It is likely that there will be Levelling Up Fund opportunities next year, and some people are thinking, is it best that we plan for them? Because we don't believe we're going to be in a position now. So I absolutely agree with you, it's a massive problem, but that is one, I would say talk to the local authority, and I would say, consider whether actually strategically and practically it's better to consider next year's bidding opportunities, but obviously absolutely appreciate there's no guarantees of that.
And Mandy Young has asked if there's any knowledge yet on the second round of Level Up Fund to be live in 2022.
Absolutely not, but all I know is what is set out in the prospectus about that they are expecting this year and then another round, there to be subsequent rounds for the total amount of spend for 24-25, but I know no more than what's in the prospectus on that.
Nicola Monk's got her hand raised.
Oh, yes, Nicola.
Me again. Judith, you don't happen to know anything about the capacity funding for the Levelling Up, and how that's going to be allocated and at what time? Because I think as a priority one area, when I read the kind of the guidance and the technical information, I got the impression that Luton would be allocated 125k. But I didn't know whether that would be in time so that we could use it for a bid for round one, or whether it was a general allocation just to help us get in a place to be able to do some bidding.
My belief is, and I am just going through the guidance now, but my belief was that, here we go. Okay. So capacity funding will be provided to local authorities in England in the most need, so in the priority one cases. It doesn't actually, okay, so flat 125 capacity will be allocated to all eligible local authorities. Primary intention of supporting to develop their bids for later rounds of the fund. Yes, I did have it in mind that it's not going to be available now. And so, yes, it's certainly on page 23 of the guidance. It seems to be suggesting that you won't get it now, but you as Luton and North Northants should get it for future funds, but it doesn't indicate when that would be. So that probably isn't what you wanted to hear, but that appears to be what paragraph 10.3 on page 23 says.